Good afternoon and welcome to the fifth lecture of the Harmony and Faith and Science, a six-lecture series sponsored by the APAVM. We have had exceptional response for the past four lectures, averaging more than 200 participants. As we near the end of the series, I'm glad to note that we are so far at over 100 joining us today. My name is Charlie Rufino. I am a director of the APAVM and based in the Philippines. I am delighted to be your moderator today. Before we start, your laptops have been muted. Yes, you will be able to ask questions at the end of the lecture by typing them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Father Paul will try to answer as much as he can within the time constraints. Today, we will enjoy a wonderful and illuminating talk on the Vatican Observatory's 400 plus years of science and faith. Father Paul Mueller is a Jesuit father. For many in the Philippines, there is a special bond because of their strong influence in education. My sons are proud products of their very fine school. Father Paul is a physicist, earning a BA at Boston University and ordained priest in 1993. He is also an historian with a doctorate including philosophy from the University of Chicago, and he was appointed as a professor of philosophy at the Loyola University Chicago. Since 2010, he has been stationed in the Vatican Observatory, the Astronomical Research and Institute of the Popes in Castel Gandolfo, Italy. He is also the Jesuit Superior and Vice Director of the Observatory. He also teaches philosophy part-time at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. Please welcome Father Paul.
It's a pleasure and privilege to have this opportunity to be with you. Let me begin by assuring you, all of you participating, of my prayers. The people you're looking at now are people important in the history of the Vatican Observatory. Pope Gregory XIII, Jesuit Father Angelo Secchi, Pope Leo XIII, and Pope Pius XI. They'll come up along the way in my talk, but over the next 45 minutes or so, I'll be talking about the notion of harmony in faith and science and how it's changed and evolved over time in the Catholic Church, and in particular in the Vatican Observatory. To get at my topic, I'm going to focus, if I can get my screen to change, there we go. I'm going to focus on three historical figures. Christopher Clavius, all of them Jesuits. Christopher Clavius, Father Angelo Secchi, and Father George Coyne. These are all Jesuits associated with the Vatican Observatory. Later in the talk, I have a bit more to say about the Vatican Observatory and how it was founded in the late, and how it was founded in the 1500s. But for starters, just to get us oriented, I'd like to talk about the present day Vatican Observatory briefly. Having trouble getting my screen to go. There it goes. Since 1935, the Vatican Observatory headquarters has been at the Pope's summer vacation home in the hilltop town of Castel Gandolfo, outside of Rome. At that location, the observatory has four telescopes. Two of them are located under domes on top of the Pope's modest summer vacation home, and two of them are located in the adjacent papal gardens, which are quite beautiful. These are all older vintage telescopes, but they're no longer useful for astronomical research. There's too much light nearby from Rome, the telescopes are old, etc. That's why the Vatican Observatory now has a new telescope on Mount Graham in Arizona. Since 1993, I should say, it's that new. It's located 160 kilometers east of the city of Tucson at an altitude of 3,000 meters. There's our telescope up close. The observatory's resident research staff of Jesuit research astronomers, half of them are based in the USA at Arizona, and half of them are based in Castel Gandolfo. The ones in Arizona have access to the Vatican telescope and to other telescopes managed by the University of Arizona. The ones at Castel Gandolfo have access to the Observatory's astronomical library, its archives, its vast collection of meteorites, and of course to our Vatican colleagues. That's just a quick introduction to the present day Vatican Observatory. But now to the meat of my talk, if I may. I'd like to begin with Christopher Clavius and the origins of the Vatican Observatory in the late 1500s, prior to the scientific revolution, and this was in connection with the reform of the calendar under Pope Gregory XIII. You're going to have to bear with me for a couple minutes. I'm going to do some history because there's some background needed here regarding the reform of the calendar. Our story begins actually quite a bit earlier with the Council of Nicaea, the great ecumenical Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. As you may know, the Council of Nicaea was very much concerned to bring unity to the early Christian church. The Nicene Creed, which we recite at Mass, was promulgated by the Council for the sake of Christian unity. It was a set of basic beliefs that all Christians could and should profess. The Council also tried to get all Christians to celebrate Easter on the same date. It decreed that Easter should be celebrated on the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. So far, so good, no problem. But the Council went further, also decreeing that the date of the spring equinox would be March 21st. By doing that, the Council created a slow ticking time bomb in the calendar. The calendar in use at the time of the Council of Nicaea was the Julian calendar that had been in use since 46 BC, when it was introduced by Julius Caesar. It was a simple repeating cycle of 4 years, 3 years of 365 days each, followed by a leap year of 366 days. If you do the math, you'll see that the average length of the year on the Julian calendar was 365 1/4 days, or 365 days, 6 hours. But wait a minute, there's a problem. Greek astronomers had been aware, even a century earlier, that the true astronomical year, the length of time from one spring equinox to the next, is 365 days, 5 hours, 48 minutes, and 45 seconds, about 11 minutes shorter than what was presumed by the Julian calendar. Due to that small discrepancy of 11 minutes per year, in the centuries after the Council of Nicaea, the astronomical spring equinox gradually drifted earlier in the year at a rate of about 3 days every 400 years. So by the mid-1500s, the true astronomical spring equinox, the date on which night and day are of equal length, fell on March 11th, not March 21st. Now, in the context of the Protestant Reformation, which was calling into question various aspects of Catholic belief and practice, that 10-day gap between the true astronomical spring equinox and the spring equinox as defined by the Council of Nicaea had become something of a scandal, since the date of Easter was determined based on the date of the spring equinox. Protestants could make fun of Catholics for their long-term willingness to tolerate this inconsistency. And even for Catholics, it was a source of some anxiety and confusion, since it's a mortal sin if you fail to go to Mass on Easter. You have an existential interest in knowing the correct date of Easter. It would be a shame to end up falling into mortal sin and going to hell by mistake and unawares just because of someone else's error in calculating the date of the spring equinox. The Council of Trent was called in the middle of the 16th century to address the various challenges posed by the Protestant Reformation. In 1545, Trent decreed that steps should be taken to fix the calendar so that the true astronomical spring equinox would always occur on March 21st, in agreement with what the Council of Nicaea had decreed. Some years later, Pope Gregory XIII appointed a commission to study the matter and to recommend the best solution. Jesuit Father Christopher Clavius, a young professor of mathematics at the Jesuits' Roman College, was one of 9 commission members. In 1580, the commission submitted its report to Pope Gregory. And on February 24th, 1582, Pope Gregory, via the papal bull Inter Gravissimas, promulgated a new calendar to replace the old Julian calendar. And this Gregorian calendar is the calendar that we still use today. Now, when the new calendar was implemented in 1582, the way it worked was this: 10 days got skipped. October 4th was followed immediately by October 15th. That served to put the spring equinox back on March 21st, where the Council of Nicaea said it should be, and to ensure that the equinox would stay on March 21st from year to year. In the Gregorian calendar, there's a leap year every 4 years, but not quite every 4 years. There's no leap year in years that are evenly divisible by 100, but not by 400. The Gregorian calendar is not perfect. There's still a small drift relative to the spring equinox, but the Gregorian calendar drifts at a rate of only 1 day every 3,030 years, which is a lot better than the Julian calendar's 3 days every 400 years. Okay. Thank you for your patience with all that history. Thank you for hanging in there. How on earth is all this relevant to the question of harmony in faith and science? If you've ever visited the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome in the Vatican, you know that its vast spaces are chock full of paintings, mosaics, and statues portraying holy men and women from throughout history. Among all those many images, there's only 2 Jesuits portrayed. There's a large statue of St. Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. He's displayed prominently in the nave of the basilica, grouped with statues of other founders of religious orders. He's portrayed holding a copy of his famous spiritual exercises, as you'd expect. He's also portrayed treading underfoot a female figure representing temptation and sin. Maybe that's not the most enlightened portrayal. The only other Jesuit who's portrayed in St. Peter's Basilica is Christopher Clavius, and it's not a very prominent portrayal at all. Clavius appears merely in a supporting role on the tomb of Pope Gregory XIII. He's carved in relief, shown as a very small figure presenting the new calendar to Pope Gregory. If I may do a parenthesis, I want to note in passing that though Clavius is remembered today mainly because of his role in the reform of the calendar, he had a very long and productive Jesuit life. During his many years of teaching at the Jesuits' Roman College and through the many textbooks he wrote in mathematics and astronomy, which became widely used standard texts, he trained and prepared many who later became the innovators and discoverers in the scientific revolution. Also, Clavius lobbied long and successfully to enhance and elevate the status of mathematics and the role of mathematics faculty in the curriculum of Jesuit schools. This is reflected in the famous Ratio Studiorum of 1599, the pedagogical standard which was promulgated for Jesuit schools throughout the world. The reforms and standards of the Ratio Studiorum were emulated widely in non-Jesuit schools in lands both Catholic and Protestant. And this ended up helping to produce in the first half of the 17th century, in the next 50 years, generations of students with a new appreciation for how mathematics might relate to physics and other sciences. The most obvious example is René Descartes, who studied under Clavius's brand new curriculum at the Jesuit school at La Flèche in France. For all these reasons, the famous historian of science, George Sarton, called Clavius the most influential teacher of the Renaissance. Okay, back to the calendar. After the new calendar had been promulgated, Pope Gregory gave Christopher Clavius a special mission to explain and defend the calendar. In 1588, Clavius put out an 800-page book explaining how the new calendar works and including page after page of tables showing calculations of the correct dates for Easter and other Christian feasts thousands of years into the future. The book had a very wide circulation and ensured that Clavius's name became known far and wide. If you'd like to know more about the reform of the calendar, but you don't feel that your Latin and math skills are quite up to reading Clavius's 800-page book, may I recommend, if you can find it, a charming little book written by one of my former professors, Professor Abner Shimoni, Tebaldo and the Whole of the Calendar. The fictional conceit of this book is that a little boy named Tebaldo was upset to learn that his 12th birthday would get skipped when the calendar jumped from October 4th to October 15th in 1582. Little Tebaldo, upset about this, ended up appealing all the way to Pope Gregory XIII for a solution. As you read the fictional tale of Tebaldo in this book, you end up learning along the way a great deal, wonderful things about church history, about Renaissance medicine, about Roman numerals, about astronomy and the reform of the calendar. It's a book that teaches effectively while also entertaining. So I think Christopher Clavius, who was known as a teacher, would be pleased by this book. And it's a fond memory for Professor Shimoni for me. He died several years ago. Okay, as I said, Clavius had the mission of explaining and defending the calendar. To that end, between 1578 and 1580, Pope Gregory had a new tower built in the Vatican. He equipped that tower with astronomical instruments and a meridian line. Here's where the tower is located. The Gregorian Tower was above what's now the Tower of the Wind. It's called the Tower of the Winds now. It's located above the present day Gallery of Maps in the Vatican Museum. It's decorated on all sides with frescoes. It's beautiful up there. You'll see here that in one of the frescoes, there's a little hole up in the wall. And through that hole in the wall, sunshine comes in a beam and shines down on the floor. That's a meridian line used to measure the position of the sun. Clavius, being a master teacher and mathematician and scientist, made use of this tower with its astronomical instruments and meridian line to explain and defend the calendar. He would bring unpersuaded doubters to the beautiful room at the top of the tower. And in that impressive and beautiful setting, he could make measurements and demonstrations using the meridian line and other instruments to explain and defend the calendar. So this was the origin of the Vatican Observatory. The observatory's first setting was this Gregorian tower, the Tower of the Winds, with its meridian line and instruments. And the observatory's first mission, the reason why it was founded, was to help explain and defend the calendar. If I may give another brief aside, if you'd like to know more about the Tower of the Winds and about its meridian line, especially meridian lines that were installed in churches and other religious buildings, and if you have an appetite for history of science, you could do worse than to look at this book by John Heilbrunn, who's just a fabulous historian of science. His book, The Sun and the Church, explores the science and history behind the installation of meridian lines in various great churches throughout Europe. This made great churches throughout Europe into giant astronomical observatories with both science and worship happening in the same space. There's harmony of science and faith right there, built into the churches. Clavius, who as a Jesuit was eager to find God in all things, would be pleased. The new calendar did indeed need to be explained and defended by Clavius and others. There was resistance to change. The Orthodox churches rejected the new calendar, seeing it as a unilateral imposition from Rome, as a papal power play. Protestant countries were not inclined to accept anything decreed by the Catholic Pope. England accepted the Gregorian calendar only in 1751, nearly 200 years after it was introduced. In the American colonies, only in 1752. By that time, England and the United States had to skip ahead by 11 days, not 10. Orthodox Russia accepted the Gregorian calendar only after the Bolshevik Revolution. What does all this have to do with the issue of harmony in faith and science? The really interesting thing, I think, is that the question of harmony in faith and science simply did not come up for the Council of Nicaea, for Pope Gregory the 13th, and for the Council of Trent, for any of these people. They weren't concerned. They weren't asking the question about harmony in faith and science. When the Council of Nicaea declared the date of the spring equinox to be March 21st, it was not a case of the church trying to claim priority over science or to assert control over scientific faith. The church was just acting out of a pastoral concern to foster Christian unity and to avoid dissent, trying to get all Christian churches to agree regarding the date of the spring equinox and Easter. When the Council of Trent decreed that the calendar needed to be fixed, it was acting out of a pastoral concern to avoid confusion and anxiety for the faithful. In effect, the church was acknowledging that the Council of Nicaea had goofed, that it shouldn't have set a time bomb by being inattentive to science and to the problems of the Julian calendar. For the sake of promoting Christian unity and avoiding dissent and confusion, the Council of Trent depended on science and presupposed the truth of science. No question of worrying about harmony. When Pope Gregory the 13th chose his particular solution to the problem of the calendar by promulgating the Gregorian calendar that we use today, he did not choose the simplest of the various possible solutions that had been proposed, nor did he choose the calendar that astronomers would have preferred. He chose the calendar that was the best available solution, all things considered, to the pastoral problem. The Gregorian calendar was sufficiently accurate. It didn't impede the work of astronomers. It resolved the confusion about the date of the spring equinox, and it didn't threaten Christian unity by tampering with the method established by the Council of Nicaea for determining the date of Easter. That solution was good enough for science and good enough for the faith, and it was not determined by a worry about harmony. The collaboration of science and faith was presupposed. It's only since the rise of modern science and the church's controversies with Galileo that faith and science have come to be seen as competitors or enemies in need of being harmonized. Who is it who gets to say whether it's the earth that moves or the sun or both? Is it faith or science? Who is it who gets to say whether biological species evolve and change? And if so, how? Is it faith or science? Who gets to say whether the bread and wine really change in the Holy Mass? And if so, how? Is it faith or science? Who gets to say whether an embryo in the womb is a human person? Is it faith or science? On these questions and many others, science and faith have ended up talking past each other, usually appealing to different criteria of truth. My point right now is not that we can somehow go back to the time before Galileo, to that time when faith and science, perhaps naively, didn't need to be harmonized. That genie's out of the bottle. Times have changed. We can't go back. But my point is that nowadays we need to remember that science and faith need not be seen as natural competitors and enemies. There was a time when they were not competitors or enemies. And my point is also that the church is at its best and at its truest when it's not doing battle with science over who gets to say what's true. It's at its best and truest when it depends on science appropriately for help in its project of fostering Christian unity and avoiding dissent and anxiety and confusion. If I may finish with Clavius. 35 craters in the moon are named for Jesuits. A particularly large crater is named Clavius. You can see it down there at the bottom of the moon. In Stanley Kubrick's movie, 2001: A Space Odyssey, there's the Clavius crater. I should have done the close-up. There it is. In Stanley Kubrick's movie, 2001: A Space Odyssey, the US moon base is called Clavius Base. You may recall that at the beginning of the movie, 2001, the primordial race, our distant human ancestors, encounter a mysterious alien monolith which is somehow a midwife to a giant leap forward for the alien species. For the first time, humans begin to use tools. They begin to use bones as weapons to strike down their enemies. The movie concludes with the intimation that humans are poised to make another giant leap forward, once again after encountering a mysterious alien monolith. This unspecified leap forward is symbolized by the strange star child or space embryo, which is seen approaching Earth at the end of the film. If I may wax metaphoric, this is a flight of fancy. I like to think that Christopher Clavius, through his teaching, his textbooks, his curricular reforms, his midwifing with the scientific revolution, and his work on the calendar, I like to think that Christopher Clavius was a midwife of a great leap forward for humanity. So I kind of see him as being like the monolith in 2001. Forgive me for that flight of fancy, but I can't resist. I think Christopher Clavius is one of the great hidden, forgotten architects of human progress, and it's worth knowing more about him. Moving on from Clavius to my second figure, Angelo Secchi. If Christopher Clavius lived at a time when faith and science were not yet seen as being opposed, Jesuit Father Angelo Secchi lived at a time when the popular perception of the Catholic Church as the enemy of science and modernity was at a peak. His Jesuit life was in the second half of the 19th century, and it coincided with the declaration of papal infallibility by Vatican Council I, with the fall of Rome and Italy's seizure of the Papal States, and with Pope Pius IX declaring himself to be the prisoner of the Vatican. What could harmony in faith and science look like in that difficult context? Coming from the north of Italy, Angelo Secchi entered the Jesuits in 1833. During his Jesuit formation, he studied astronomy at Stonyhurst College in England, and also physics and meteorology at Georgetown University in the USA. At the age of 32, he was named director of the Astronomical Observatory of the Jesuits at the Roman College, which he expanded onto the roof of the Jesuits' Church of St. Ignatius right next door. If you've not been there, this church is a Baroque wonder. Here's the ceiling of the Church of St. Ignatius, this amazing illusionistic painting of the heavenly court. Off to the side of that, you can see a dome. This is off to the side, the great dome of the church. But wait a minute, it's not really a dome. It's an illusionistic painting of a dome. When you come in, you think there's a dome, but when you walk to the front of the church, you see it's a flat ceiling painted to look like a dome. If you go up on top of the church, you see that's where Angelo Secchi installed his astronomical observatory at the Roman College, with the main telescope being on top of the dome. The dome was built strong enough to hold up, the church was built strong to hold up a dome so it could hold a telescope. There's the plan of his observatory atop the church. Nowadays, if you go up there, there's only ruins, because in 1870, Italy took everything. The normal thing for astronomers of that period was to focus on measuring and analyzing the locations and motions of stars and planets. But Secchi's background in physics led him to ask new questions about objects in the heavens. Not just where are they, but how are they? Not just where are they and how are they moving, but what are they? What's their physics and chemistry? He used the new technique of spectroscopy to observe the spectra of thousands of stars. And on that basis, he was the first one to classify stars into different types on the basis of similarities and differences in their spectra, on the basis of the physics going on inside them. And he's the first to realize that our own sun fits into one of these categories. Our sun fits into one of Secchi's four types of stars. Because of Secchi's work with spectroscopy and his development of this classification system and his analysis of the physics of the stars, He's considered to be one of the fathers, if not the father, of the field of astrophysics. Secchi participated in the Universal Exposition of 1867 at Paris, representing the Vatican as director of the Observatory of the Roman College, which by that time had become a papal pontifical observatory. He was awarded a gold medal for his meteograph, pictured here, a big gizmo, which recorded weather conditions automatically. He was also made a member of the Legion of Honor, which is rather extraordinary at the time, given the widespread French anti-clericalism. Secchi also did outstanding work on terrestrial magnetism and solar physics. The instrument of the NASA spacecraft studying solar weather in orbit around the sun is called the Sun-Earth Connection Coronal and Heliospheric Investigation, SECCHI, Secchi. Secchi also did important work in limnology. The Secchi disk, which he invented in 1865, remains the standard tool for measuring the clarity of water in lakes and oceans. But now we get into questions of harmony and faith and science. In the politics, harmony and faith, science, and politics. In 1870, Secchi was appointed as representative of the Holy See to the International Committee charged with redefining the scientific standard length of the meter. The meter had originally been defined as 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the equator to the North Pole. A metal bar matching that length was kept at Paris and served as the standard meter. But by the 1860s, scientists needed a more precise and practical definition of the meter. In 1870, while Secchi was serving on the International Committee to redefine the meter, Rome fell, and Italy seized the Papal States, and the Pope became the prisoner of the Vatican. At that point, Italy protested Secchi's membership on the International Committee, saying that the country he represented no longer existed, and he should be sent home. But in the end, after several years of back and forth controversy, Secchi was retained as a member of the committee representing the Vatican. His expertise was valued that much. And it was the Italian representatives who were sent home and excluded from the committee. This was seen as a personal triumph for Secchi and as a diplomatic victory for the Holy See. In fact, upon his return to Rome, Secchi was received in audience by Pope Pius IX, and he wrote in his diary, quote, "The Pope welcomed me with a hand raised, saying, 'I vote for Secchi.'" Secchi's scientific accomplishments and reputation had proved to be useful to the Holy See, not just scientifically, but politically and diplomatically, and in the court of public opinion. So now, fast forward to the year 20 years, to the year 1891. By that time, the Vatican Observatory had been out of existence for 20 years, ever since Italy had seized the Roman College and had seized all the astronomical equipment in Secchi's observatory. In 1891, a large exposition of scientific instruments was organized in the Vatican in honor of the Jubilee, the priestly Jubilee of Pope Leo XIII. After the Jubilee celebration, Pope Leo decided to maintain the scientific instruments permanently in the Tower of the Winds and to establish a research staff to make use of those instruments to do meteorology and astronomy. This was Pope Leo officially refounding the Vatican Observatory, and he made it official in his motu proprio ut mysticam, saying that he was refounding the observatory. Why? So that everyone might see clearly that the church and her pastors are not opposed to true and solid science, whether human or divine, but that they embrace it, encourage it, and promote it with the fullest possible devotion. What Pope Leo was saying explicitly was the Vatican Observatory, by its existence and work, shows that the church is open to science and wants to take part in science. From the church's perspective, there is not and should not and could not be any tension or conflict between faith and science. There is harmony in science and faith. What Pope Leo was, that's what he said explicitly. What Pope Leo was not saying explicitly, but what we can read between the lines, is that he had refounded the Vatican Observatory as the national observatory of the Vatican at a time when the Vatican was not recognized as a nation by Italy. Pope Leo was following the example, the playbook, if you will, of Pope Pius IX. Just as Pope Pius IX made use of Angelo Secchi diplomatically and politically, Pope Leo XIII made use of the refoundation of the Vatican Observatory politically and diplomatically for the political advantage of the Vatican. To that end, the refounded Vatican Observatory participated from its very first year in the international project of the Carte du Ciel, based at Paris, in which 18 different national observatories collaborated to make a detailed photographic map of the entire sky. 18 national observatories. The Vatican Observatory participated as one of these observatories, with Italy once again protesting. The Vatican Observatory obtained a telescope of the required type and installed it on the Leonine Tower of the Vatican walls. Observations were undertaken, analyzed, and published. Did the participation of the pre-scientists of the Vatican Observatory in the Carte du Ciel project serve to advance scientific knowledge? Yes. Was their participation an effective sign that the Catholic Church wanted to have harmony in faith and science, that it wanted to put the Galileo controversy behind it, and that it was willing to respect the autonomy of science and scientific knowledge and to support and participate in science? Yes. Was it politically and diplomatically advantageous to the Holy See to have its own national observatory, participate with other national observatories in an international project? Yes. At this delicate moment in history, after Vatican I, but prior to Vatican II, after the fall of Rome, but prior to the Lateran Treaty of 1929, still under the shadow of the Galileo affair, and with growing controversies over Darwinism, the refounding of the Vatican Observatory in 1891 can be seen as the down payment on harmony in the faith and science on the part of the Church, as a gesture and aspiration and hope for that harmony. But it's also a strategic diplomatic move on the part of the Church, a gesture having more to do with politics and power than with harmony in faith and science. Enough of Secchi, let me move to Father George Coyne. The Ecumenical Council of Vatican II asserted straightforwardly that doing science is a good thing, that it poses no threat to faith. In fact, doing science gives glory to God. Far from thinking that works produced by our own talents and energy are in opposition to God's power, and that the rational creature exists as a kind of rival to the Creator, Christians are convinced that the triumphs of the human race are a sign of God's grace and the flowering of God's own mysterious design. Pope John XXIII once remarked to the Jesuits of the Vatican Observatory that their mission should be that of explaining the Church to the world of science and explaining the world of science to the Church. In a 1988 letter to Father George Coyne, then director of the observatory, Pope John Paul II remarked, and this is a marvelous letter, well worth reading the whole letter. It's available online. Science can purify religion from error and superstition. Religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. Each can draw the other into a wider world, a world in which both can flourish. Father George Coyne took those words to heart in his life and in his long service as director of the observatory from 1978 to 2006. Father George died just last year in February, right at the start of the COVID pandemic. He's much beloved and much missed, and we remain sad that so far we've not been able to celebrate his life because of the pandemic. He lived and breathed harmony in faith and science. For him, that meant recognizing and respecting science, its methods, its truths, its methods, results, and recognizing also the truths of the faith and putting those truths in respectful mutual dialogue. How did he do that? In many practical ways. For one thing, he moved the Vatican Observatory into the mainstream of astronomical research. Traditionally, the Jesuits had done very good observational scientific work on their own, but without much direct collaboration with the rest of the scientific world. Father Coyne invited outside scientists in, and he set the Jesuit astronomers out. In fact, he established an official relationship of collaboration with the University of Arizona, which resulted in them having their own telescope. The Jesuits, the Observatory, are able to collaborate and work at Arizona, making use of a whole network of telescopes. Since the 1980s, every other year, Father George organized a month-long summer school in astronomy. Each time, 25 promising young astronomers would be selected from a pool of 150 to 200 applicants. They would live and study together in an intensive graduate level course of study at Castel Gandolfo, with each school focusing on some particular topic in astronomy, with a faculty composed of outside experts as well as Jesuits. Faith and theology were never officially part of the curriculum for these schools, but those topics always came up frequently in informal discussion. That was the general way of proceeding for Father George, which he modeled for the Jesuits, the Observatory. They work as research astronomers, publishing and participating in the academic world of science in conferences and in journals. But as friendships form and over coffee or dinner at conferences, conversations turn to topics of faith and theology. St. Ignatius Loyola said that the Jesuit evangelical strategy is to bring them, go in their door and bring them out your door. Meet them where they are. That's the way of proceeding at the Observatory with its Jesuit scientists today, and that's what was modeled by Father George Coyne. At the request of Pope John Paul II, Father George Coyne organized an extended series of high-level academic conferences, gathering scientists and philosophers and theologians to reflect from various scientific perspectives on the question of divine action. How does God interact in the world? The published proceedings of those conferences give an important contribution and impetus to Catholic involvement in the faith-science dialogue. I've already mentioned that Father Coyne's approach to relating the church to scientists and meet the scientists where they are, do science with them, live and breathe with them, science with them, but do it as a person of faith. Go in their door, bring them out your door. That's how science and faith operate in harmony at the Vatican Observatory today, in that very practical, down-home way. The other side of how harmony and faith and science can relate to each other, and this is where George Coyne followed the lead of Pope John Paul II, is by encouraging the church to be light on its feet with respect to science. Pastoral problems occur when scientific theories change because the church has no choice but to depend on science to express theological truths. For 1,500 years, the church explained and illustrated the Christian doctrine that God made the world for us, that we're at the center of God's love and care, by pointing to the commonly accepted cosmology in which the earth was motionless at the center, and all other planets and stars revolved around us. How do you know God made the world for us? Because everything goes around us. Well, part of the reason why Galileo got into trouble is that it seemed to people that by rejecting the earth-centered cosmology, he was also rejecting the theological doctrine that we're at the center of God's love and care. That wasn't the case. The problem was people were confusing the enduring true doctrine that we're at the center of God's love and care with the particular way that that doctrine was being illustrated and explained by analogy to the earth being at the center. Something similar happened with Darwin's theory of evolution. For 1,500 years, the idea of the commonly accepted idea that species remain stable and unchanging over time was used to illustrate and explain the Christian doctrine that God made the world for us. Each species of plant and animal was seen as having been designed by God to serve us in some particular way. When Darwin proposed his theory of evolution and rejected the idea that species remain stable over time, it seemed to people that he was rejecting the doctrine that God made the world for us. No, that wasn't the case. Once again, people were confusing the enduring true doctrine that God made the world for us with a particular way of illustrating and explaining that doctrine, species are stable and unchanging. The same thing happens with respect to Thomas Aquinas's so-called proofs of the existence of God. Aquinas never intended those proofs to be utterly convincing arguments that God exists. All that Aquinas was trying to do was to show that relative to the accepted science of his day, it's not unreasonable to believe that God exists. And more delicately, the same thing happens with respect to Aquinas's explanation of the Eucharist in terms of transubstantiation. Aquinas developed his explanation of the Eucharist in terms of transubstantiation as a way of showing that relative to the accepted science of his day, it was not unreasonable to believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. That's the challenge that Pope John Paul II gave, in particular in a talk to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. It's a challenge that Father George Coyne accepted. How do you help Christianity to be light on its feet with respect to how it makes use of science? Christianity has no choice but to appeal to the language and images provided by science to illustrate and explain Christian doctrine. But as Christian doctrine evolves and changes, as science evolves and changes, and Christian doctrine remains the same, Christianity has to be light on its feet, letting go of this explanation and adopting a new explanation. If we can do that, that will be harmony enough. And that is the end of my talk. I thank you for your kind attention. I say God bless you, and I assure you of my prayers.
Thank you very much, Father Paul. It's really outstanding to hear all about the impact of the Jesuits on the history. We have a lot of questions for you, Father Paul, today. So let me try and start off with what I can read here in the Q&A box. So we have a question from Mr. William Chang. Based on Christopher Clavius' calculation as recorded in his book, when will the next adjustment of the current calendar be needed? Does modern-day astronomical calculation validate the accuracy of the Gregorian calendar and concur with Clavius' calculation of the calendar going out into the next 100 years?
The current calendar will remain accurate to within 1 day for the next 3,030 years. So after about 3,030 years, we might need, if we want to keep the spring equinox on March 21st, we might need to make a small adjustment. But we're good to go for at least 3,000 years. And that's why Clavius was able to calculate the date of the religious feasts 3,000 years into the future in his book. So yeah, it's quite accurate. It's not exactly accurate, but it's accurate enough for the next few thousand years.
Okay, very good to know. We have a second question from Sharon. Is the Vatican Observatory still very much the domain of the Jesuits?
It is. Since the early 1900s, the Church has entrusted the mission of the Vatican Observatory to the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus. The core staff, the core residential research staff of the observatory is all Jesuits. It's a residential Jesuit community. However, we have another circle of adjunct scholars, laymen and women, and also diocesan priests who are officially affiliated with the Vatican Observatory and who collaborate with us, with the observatory, on research and publishing and investigation. So it's a Vatican work entrusted to the Society of Jesus with a network of official lay collaborators.
Thank you. We have just a couple of more questions. One from Joan. When Pope Gregory changed the calendar in 1582, he was able to influence only the Catholic Church and its lands. The UK and its colonies, including America, did not change until 1752, and Russia only changed to the Gregorian calendar in 1919. Can you explain why they finally did?
Well, those are questions. That's a question of politics more than science. I think it was partly to be in common with the rest of the world. I mean, it became inconvenient to have different calendars functioning. Beyond that, I don't know. It's I think also maybe just the whole idea of that this was seen as somehow kowtowing to Rome or submitting to Rome became less of a political worry for them. I suspect that was the main reason. The calendar made sense. Quite apart from calculating religious feasts, it's just nice for farmers to be able to depend on the spring equinox and the planting season coming at the same point in the calendar each year. So it just made sense rationally to adopt a calendar that was in sync with the seasons. But the resistance was all due to political reasons and resistance to the influence of the Pope. And I guess it just became less of a worry at some point, or became overcome. I don't know beyond that.
Thank you, Father Paul. I have a final question from Bruce. What major projects or significant work is the Vatican Observatory engaging in now? And how have these efforts been affected by the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, the second question first. The coronavirus pandemic has been difficult for us, as for everyone. There was a letter came out from the Vatican Secretary of State a year ago in March, saying basically, due to the pandemic and due to the financial limitations it's imposing, you must realize that the Vatican Observatory is part of the Vatican City State, and the Vatican City State basically gets almost all of its income from the Vatican museums, from tourism. With the stop of tourism, it's been a great financial hardship for the Vatican City State, as for everyone else. Anyway, the Secretary of State sent a letter out saying, okay, in light of the dangers of contagion and also due to the financial stress, no travel, no public events, no conferences, basically no activity. So in these last year and a half, we've continued our work, but it's like everyone else, the collaboration has all been online. We've not been able to get together with our scientific colleagues and collaborators around the world as normally we would. We had to cancel our summer school. We had already accepted students for summer school for the summer of 2020, and it had to be canceled, unfortunately. What that's meant is that over the last year and a half, the work of the observatory has proceeded on a much more individual basis. Each of the Jesuit scientists has been able to continue his research and his work in his office on the computer. And eventually, after a few months, people were able to return to the telescope, only alone, not in groups, and do some observing, but it has limited the work. The main loss has been the collaboration, which is so important to science, the kind of group collaboration and mutual sparking of ideas that comes from people being together. For us, as for everyone else, COVID has made that more difficult.
Thank you, Father.
I was also asked what projects we're working on. I should point out that the Vatican Observatory is kind of a peculiar research institution in this sense. Usually a research institution would have people in various subfields collaborating on a common research project of the institution. We're weird in this sense, since the Vatican Observatory is supposed to function in some ways as the face of the church to the world of science. Instead of looking inward towards each other, we look outwards. Each of the Jesuit researchers has a big outside network of collaborators, scientific collaborators. And so instead of being a group of people looking inward, we look outward. It's actually a challenge for us sometimes at the observatory, what our common project is. We really don't have a common scientific project. Our common project is promoting the dialogue of faith and science, with each man doing that by his own scientific work. But the various Jesuits are all in different subfields of astronomy, and it's actually hard for them to collaborate with each other scientifically because they're in different subfields.
Thank you, Father Paul. We have also a number of questions, but we'll have to get back to that. You'll have to get back to them on the chat. So anyway, thank you very much. And we now have a little information. Okay, so I hope you all enjoyed the lecture today. The last in the series continues next week on the Saturday, same time. And we will have a truly exciting session as a Shroud of Turin with Father Andrew Dalton. So Father Andrew Dalton's lecture follows on from the outstanding lecture we had last week on transhumanism, the imperfect scientific quest for human perfection by Father Michael Maggot. So do join us again next week on Saturday, the 17th of July at the same time for Lecture 6 in the series. Father Andrew promised to be a most engaging speaker, so mark this event in your diary, and if possible, invite your friends to also come along. Please do consider a patronship membership with the APAVM. We'd love to have you enjoy more lectures and hopefully on visits to the Vatican when time permits. Thank you once again for joining us, and we look forward to your participation again next time, next Saturday. God bless and have a nice weekend ahead.